Welcome everyone. I can see that people are beginning to come in. It's nice to know that you're all there. We hope within a couple of months we'll actually be able to do this in the flesh and no longer do it on Zoom, because people are perhaps getting a little bit over Zoom. But nonetheless, we're really pleased to have Caroline Overington here tonight to talk to Suzanne Leal, and we'll be talking about Missing William Tyrrell, Caroline's latest book. I'm just keeping an eye on the numbers, and yes, plenty of you are in, so I think I'm going to make a start. So I'd like to begin by welcoming everyone to our second virtual event in the Bad Sydney Crime Writers Festival series of Bad All Year interviews with crime writers, of course. My name is Catherine Dupoulou-Ménager, and I'm the Artistic Director of Bad Sydney. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of country throughout Australia and wherever you're viewing us from tonight. We recognise their continuing connection to land, waters, and culture, and pay our respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. So some of you may not yet be totally familiar with Bad Sydney. I'll tell you a little bit about ourselves. We're an annual festival celebrating crime writing of all kinds, fiction, true crime, and looking at the impact of crime on society. The dates of the festival this year are the 11th to the 13th of September, and it really is looking as if we'll be able to see you in person, which is fantastic. Have a look at our website, badsydney.com. But now let's get on to tonight's interview. I'd like to welcome Caroline Overington, who's looking very warm.
Hello.
In a lovely jumper.
My mother made it, which is nice.
That's very nice. Caroline's going to talk about her latest book, Missing William Tyrrell, where she talks about the disappearance of the little boy we all got used to seeing with his gorgeous smile and his Spider-Man suit. And you're going to reveal quite a lot, I think, that we don't know, although we haven't been told. Now, Caroline's a journalist. She's a best-selling writer of fiction and of non-fiction. And she's a very good friend of Bad. And I won't be giving too much away to tell you that she'll be at Bad later this year interviewing online a very well-known US woman crime writer. And we are really excited about it. Now, Suzanne Leal, who'll be interviewing Caroline, is also very involved with Bad Sydney. And she is a huge help to me to shape the festival. She's a lawyer, she's a writer, as well as a regular interviewer at literary festivals. Not a lot of literary festivals in the last couple of months, but she'll be back at Bad in September, and she'll be interviewing people, but she'll also be talking about her own book, her own latest book, The Deceptions, which is a story moving from wartime Europe to contemporary Australia. So I think you're going to have a great time in September. But talking about great times and great writers, let's go ahead with tonight's interview. Caroline and Suzanne, welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Catherine, and good evening, everybody out there in Zoom land. I'm so delighted to be here in conversation with Caroline Overington tonight. As Catherine's told you, I'm a writer and a lawyer, and I have a particular background in criminal law and child protection. So the case of William Tyrrell has been one that has for a very long time perturbed me. William was born on the 26th of June 2011. 3 weeks later, my daughter was born. She's almost 9 now, and she's starting to think about what she'd like to do for her birthday this year. William's 9th birthday is approaching too, only his family are not able to talk to him about what he would like to do for his birthday, because William Tyrrell has been missing now for almost 6 years. Caroline Overington is a well-known and well-respected journalist and author. She's written non-fiction and fiction books that are both historical and contemporary, and she is a highly regarded investigative journalist. The case of the missing 3-year-old boy, William Tyrrell, has been one that she has followed particularly closely in her newspaper articles, in her podcast, Nowhere Child, and now in her new book, this book, Missing William Tyrrell. It was released in February this year. Hello, Caroline. Thank you so much for coming on board today to speak about this distressing and highly perplexing case.
It is perplexing, and I'm so grateful for that introduction too, Suzanne. I didn't know that your daughter was so close in age to William. It must, I mean, my own children are now 20, And I guess you forget a little bit about what it's like to have really little ones around. But for you to have a 9-year-old and to be thinking about where William would be in his life had he been allowed to continue living with those who loved him must bring a special poignancy to the reading of his story, I think, and also to the knowledge that he's a little boy missing in your home state.
I think what was particularly odd is that it was only when I started to read your book and I did the numbers that I remembered that in fact he will always, for me, be 3 years old, because that's when I heard of him, that's when he disappeared, and yet he's a child born in 2011, so he might have been a 9-year-old child. And I think it really took me aback to realise that as I was giving birth, William Tyrrell was a 3-week-old baby, and when he went missing, my child was also the same age. So I think isn't always the individual cases that get you. It's the Holocaust has meaning for the individual cases it affected rather than the horror of the whole. And missing children have a particular poignancy or a particular distress when you think of that individual child rather than the very many people that have gone missing over the years. Would you agree that it's the individual case that really gets us?
Yes, and also the idea that for many people, William will be forever 3 years old, because he was 3 years old when he went missing. And the last image we have of him is of him in the Spider-Man suit that he was wearing when he disappeared. And some of the other photographs that were taken during his very short life where he's also 3, because, you know, the police were looking for a 3-year-old. So it made sense to release images of the child that you might recognize. Now, of course, William, if he's 9 and alive today, is a very, very different little boy from the one that went missing. And occasionally police or media organisations will try to get across that gap by saying what he might look like now. But we really don't know. We really can't know what he would look like now. He lives on in the collective imaginations of Australians as a 3-year-old boy who is missing. And you're quite right. He's very different now. He's almost 9.
I'd like to take you back even further, not to the 9-year-old he might be or might have been today, not even to the 3-year-old that went missing, but to the newborn. So I want to start on the day that he was born. He was the second child in the family. Can you tell me about his parents?
Yes, so he was born in Sydney, and he did have an older sister whose name is Lindsay. That's the name that the court has given her. It's not her real name because we try as hard as we can to protect her identity. Obviously, she is entitled to her privacy. So the court knows her as Lindsay, and we all know her as Lindsay. And William was born to his parents, and there are now another 2 children in that family as well, both of them younger than William. It's fair to say that it was a troubled environment. Certainly the Department of Community Services in Victoria, which is sort of, I guess, what we know as the Welfare Department, was already a little interested in the family. There had been some allegations of drug abuse, and there'd been some other allegations that had meant that ultimately William would be removed from the care of his biological parents and would go into foster care. What's important to remember is that means that he has 2 families that are both missing him. He has his biological parents who continue to love him and continue to miss him, and he has his foster parents, also from Sydney, who also continue to love and to miss him desperately. I try to keep both families in mind all the time. It seems to me that it's not my job to say whether he should have been in care or shouldn't have been in care, or you know, which family he belonged in. I'd just like to state the facts that he was in foster care at the time of his disappearance.
So let's continue with those facts then. How old was he when he was taken from his parents, his actual parents, and put into foster care?
So when he was about 9 months old, the decision was taken to place William in the care of foster parents. The difficulty that everybody has with this case is that his biological parents objected very strenuously to the idea that he needed to be in care. They didn't want him to go into care. And so when it came time to hand him over to authorities, or for the authorities to come and take them into care, they took off. And they took off with him, and they went into hiding for about sort of 6 to 8 weeks. They were staying with a close member of their own family in a house in Sydney. William had access to a swimming pool. He was learning to swim around that time. They say that they offered him good care, and clearly the department didn't agree. And after they'd been on the run, which is an odd term to use. I mean, after they would not use that term. So they would say that after he had, after they'd had him for about 8 or 9 weeks in this house, the authorities came and removed him, and he went into foster care with a couple from the other side of town who already had his older sister in their care. So he was reunited with his older sister and taken in with a family who desperately wanted to give foster children a better life and to offer him every opportunity.
And did his foster parents have their own children, or had they fostered before?
They do not have their own children, no.
And had they fostered beforehand?
There's a number of elements of foster care that are difficult to discuss in a public way, because foster care, you're dealing with the lives of children, and so their privacy, I believe, is always paramount. It created enormous difficulties for William, the fact that he was in foster care. It meant that he was treated very differently from any other child who might go missing in New South Wales. And in some sense, the opportunity to find him was perhaps hampered by the fact that he was a foster child, and that's why it's important. But as to the reasons why he was in foster care and whether or not there are other foster children, I guess, less relevant to the case in a way, and important, I guess, to preserve the privacy of all kids in foster care.
And what I'm noticing, Caroline, as you answer that question, is that these are difficult questions to answer because you're curtailed in what you can say. And it seems that you're much less curtailed as a journalist and a writer now than you were at the beginning of the case.
Yes.
What could you, I remember just being a really secret case, and I'm thinking, what's going on and what's not being told? What changed that to allow more information to be given?
No, you're quite right. It was devastating for William. The situation that he was in foster care meant that when he first went missing, his parents, biological parents and his foster parents, were not allowed to agitate for him. They were not allowed to appeal to the public for help. They were not allowed to front the TV cameras and say, please help us, a little boy is missing. Nobody was allowed to know that he was in foster care, which is one thing, but it was devastating because a lot of people looked at the footage, the media coverage that was coming out about this little boy who was missing, and they were wondering, where are the parents? What is going on here? Why can't we see the parents? Why are we being told nothing about this case? And it made people unnecessarily suspicious. It made people think that there was something odd going on. Some people I've spoke to have said, oh, I just assumed it was a custody battle. I thought it wasn't a real missing person. I thought it was just, people fighting over kids in a divorce. Other people have said to me, oh, I thought, maybe they were in witness protection or they were involved in some kind of crime. And none of these things were true. The simple fact of the matter was that William was a foster child. But because it is illegal in New South Wales to identify a foster child, his parents, biological and foster, could not appeal for his return, for his safe return. And instead what you had was friends of the family. So friends of the family would front up to the TV cameras and say, oh, we're friends of William's family and would really like to have him brought home. And of course, the public looked at that and thought, well, there's something we're not being told. And the Australian people are not given to suspicion, and they don't tend to think about people in a negative way. But they looked at this situation and they thought, okay, you're not telling us the whole truth. And as long as we don't know the whole truth as to what's going on, we're going to feel differently about this case. And that was devastating.
And what changed? When did that information, when was that able to be disclosed?
Suzanne, I'm sad to say that it took 2 years. It took 2 years. So there were a number of interviews that were done. For example, one famous interview was done with William's foster parents where they had to sit in a dark room with their faces concealed and their voices concealed and talk to a police officer about why they wanted William to come home. A lot of people looked at that video and thought, wow, this is really odd. They also did an interview with 60 Minutes about a year into the investigation. And again, you couldn't see their faces and their voices were disguised and you weren't allowed to know anything about them. And of course, you have the problem of people thinking, well, this is odd. 2 years into the investigation, so 2 years after William went missing, finally, a member of the public who was sufficiently concerned about William's case and frustrated by all the secrecy and all the covering up and all of what she regarded as people covering their own backs, you know, because she thought, well, it's the department actually that doesn't want anyone to know that a foster child is missing. And there could be some truth to that. So she went to the Supreme Court of New South Wales. She didn't have anything to do with William. She'd never met him. She'd never met his family. She didn't even know for sure that he was a foster child. Just something in her gut told her that he was a foster child because she had been one herself. And she knew the signs. She knew the secrecy. She said to me, it smelt like docs. It smelt like foster care. That's the way she worded it to me. So she went and she stood before a judge of the Supreme Court, a terrifying environment for anyone. And she pleaded for the right for the public to know that there was nothing particularly mysterious about this case other than the fact that he was a foster child and that he deserved to be found and treated like any other child in New South Wales. And she won.
And did she represent herself? Did she have enormous legal assistance, or was it her against the forces of the state, I presume?
It was definitely her against the forces of the state. And you're quite right. They had at their disposal all of those legal representatives and high-paid lawyers, and she stood up there on her own. And she didn't have a lawyer. I asked her, did you have a lawyer? I need like a legal aid lawyer. She's not a woman who has great resources available to her. She doesn't have an enormous amount of money. She doesn't have any experience with the New South Wales Supreme Court. She'd never been in the building before. She just decided that it was the right thing to do. She had been, in fact, running around Sydney with a petition, a hand-drawn petition, trying to get 10,000 signatures that would have forced the New South Wales Parliament to open an inquiry into William's disappearance, because she was so frustrated by the fact that he hadn't been found. She wanted like a parliamentary inquiry into the investigation. Why was it going so badly and why hadn't he been found? And it was because she was running around with this petition, she came across the idea that maybe she would end up in the New South Wales Supreme Court. But when I said to her, did you have a lawyer? She said, no, I didn't have a lawyer. It was just me, myself, and I. I just stood up there and the judge said to me, what are you doing here? And she said, well, I used to be a foster child. I know what it's like to be in care. I'm frustrated by the process or the progress of this investigation. I really want William found. And I think the best way to find him is to stop all the secrecy and let the public know that he's missing and why he's missing, and that we need to find him. And so that's what she did.
And so from then on, we could be told that William was a foster child who had been living with foster parents, but who had caring parents, natural parents as well.
Right.
He disappeared from a town called Kendall. Where's Kendall?
So Kendall is about 4 hours north of Sydney. So I'm coming to you from Melbourne, but I have a home in Sydney. If I was to drive out of my driveway and head up the Pacific Highway north, it would take me about 4 hours to get to Kendall. So if you're imagining this from other corners of Australia, perhaps look at a point a little bit less than halfway between Sydney and Brisbane. But it's not a coastal town, it's an inland town. It's more bush than it is beach. It's got more eucalypt trees than it has, for example, Norfolk pines. It's a village of a very small population, only 1,000 people. And they pride themselves on the sense of community that they have there. They have, for example, a music festival. They have a farmer's market. They have a community op shop that is staffed by volunteers. There are a lot of elderly people living in Kendall who go there to retire, because you can get a house on a big bush block. You'll get a nice bit of land to run around on, some peace and quiet. I mean, a number of the neighbours who were in the street when William went missing have described their morning, and it sounds like a beautiful place to live. A lot of them were out on the deck. They were enjoying an early morning, a mid-morning snack, some of them having a cup of tea, a few biscuits. You can hear the lizards rustling, you hear magpies warbling. It's a very traditional Australian small town.
It's a very safe, idyllic town, it seems to me.
Well, I mean, we think that, but a lot has come out in the years that William has been missing, which suggests that maybe it's not so safe. I mean, just 2 weeks ago, there were arrests of people who are now considered or will now face charges that, if proven, will place them at the centre of one of the largest child pornography rings ever busted in Australia. Now, that's not to say that they are associated with the disappearance of William Tyrrell, but it does give you a sense of Kendal being, yes, on the surface, a very beautiful little town. And certainly the people who live there love it and trust their neighbours, and for a long time went out without locking the front door, and where children are able to walk to school or get the bus to school on their own. But now a different picture of Kendal is emerging.
And what was William actually doing there when he went missing?
Well, William's foster mum, her mum lived in Kendal. She'd retired to Kendal. She'd been there for years. In fact, both her parents had been there, living on a big block at 48 Benaroon Drive. That's the number and the address of their house, 48 Benaroon Drive in Kendal. Now, it's a street that ends very abruptly. So you hop onto Benaroon Drive, you turn right, it's got a corner in it, and then the street ends very abruptly. Now, some people have described it as a one-way street or a dead-end street. It's not, in fact, a dead-end street. You can get out the top end, but you need a four-wheel drive to do it. So if you get onto those bush trails, I tried to do it in my little car. I had a little hatchback, and I tried to do it, and I got stuck within 100 metres. It's really clayey and quite thick brush. But if you had a four-wheel drive, you can go banging up there, and you will eventually end up at the Kendal Cemetery. But for all intents and purposes, he was in a one-way street, or a street with a dead end. And he had arrived there on the Thursday night with his foster parents and his sister. He'd stayed overnight. And then in the morning, he'd gotten up quite early, as children tend to do. He was only 3. He'd put on his Spider-Man suit. He loved it. He'd picked it up on a trip to Bali that he'd taken with his foster parents, and he insisted on wearing it. His foster mum thought that it was a little bit cool that day, and so she had encouraged him to put on a Spider-Man t-shirt underneath. So then if he did end up taking the top off, he'd still be all Spider-Man out, was how she described it. He had some breakfast. He spent some time riding his bike up and down the driveway, not over the curb, just up and down the driveway. He raced around the garden with his foster mum, slipped on some leaves at one point. And then shortly after 10 o'clock in the morning, they were playing on the back deck. So people, I know, sometimes form the impression that they were out the front of the house and he disappeared, but that's not right. He was on the back of the house. There's a small deck on the back of the house. You can't see it from the street. And he was playing on there. It's only about 2 steps down to the grass. He jumped off the deck and he was playing a game that he'd made up himself. He called it Daddy Tiger. And what it involved was roaring like a tiger. So he would jump and he would go, rah, and then he would run. And the idea was that his foster mum would try to chase him. Now, in this particular moment, he jumped off the deck, he roared, rah, ran around the corner of the house, and then he was gone. Just completely gone. There hasn't been since then a single sound or sighting of him. And that has been one of the most perplexing things, because his foster mum was sitting there with her mum having a cup of tea, and she noticed that it had gotten quite quiet, and she got up and she walked around the same corner of the house. And so she's thinking to herself, well, I have to be able to see him. I have to be able to hear him because it's so quiet, such a big block. And he's wearing that bright red suit. So with all the green, I'm going to be able to see him quite quickly. And there was just nothing.
So his foster parents go to the house which is occupied by the foster grandmother. So the foster mother's mother. They stay overnight on the Thursday, he's playing with his sister and he disappears after the foster mother hasn't seen him for how long? 5 minutes, 10 minutes, half an hour?
The amount of time that William was missing before he went, before he's known to have disappeared, if you will, was the subject of much attention at the inquiry. So when I say the inquiry, ultimately the coroner in New South Wales did open an inquiry into the disappearance of William Tyrrell. Now, what a coroner's inquiry is the state will appoint a coroner who is a magistrate of the local courts. In this case, her name is Harriet Graham. She's incredibly experienced. She's very methodical. She's a very serious person. She's very professional. She has been out to Kendall on a number of occasions to study the scene herself. And the idea is that she will call witnesses to the coroner's court and she will interview them about what they know and what they saw. So in a case like that, that will involve, so people sometimes think, oh, coroner's court, why is it in front of the coroner's court? I mean, don't we get the coroner involved when somebody is dead? You can get the coroner involved when somebody is missing to try to ascertain what happened. And so she talked to people who live in the street. She talked to people who were in the house. She talked to people who came out to search. She talked to local sex offenders who live in the area. She calls them to the court and they are asked questions and they have to testify. They have to tell her what they know. And she, at the end of this process, which is ongoing, it's been going on for nearly 2 years, will compile a report where she will make suggestions as to what she thinks has likely happened. Now, as part of that, of course, people were intensely interested. How long was it before the foster mum noticed that William was missing? And all the evidence suggests that it was about 5 minutes. That's about what we think. So we know that, we know a few things for sure. We know, for example, that a photograph was taken of William at 9:37 in the morning. We know that because there's a timestamp on the camera. Now, the timestamp has come in for some testimony as well, because apparently the clock on the camera was wrong and they've had to recreate the time. But police are convinced that that photo was taken at 9:37 in the morning, and it shows William in his Spider-Man suit on the deck, and his sister is there and his foster nana is there. So we know he's on the deck at that time. And we also know for sure what time she made her call to 000, which was shortly before 11 a.m. So now you're looking at those two things and you're thinking, well, 9:37 and 11 a.m., you've got about an hour and a half, haven't you? Yet you have, except that there's been some phone calls to the house that we know about. And we also know that the foster mum went looking for William around the neighbourhood. So we've got the testimony of other neighbours who can sort of pinpoint what time that was. Now, it seems to the coroner that he went missing sometime between 10:15 and 10:30 in that area, and that he was missing for about 5 minutes when she noticed. And the reason we think that is because we know that she went around the corner, she spent a bit of time looking, where is he, why can't I see the red? And then she came out onto the main street and began talking to neighbours. So that's how we've tried to piece that information together.
Thank you. When a crime's committed, particularly a crime against a child or a child goes missing, the first thought isn't a stranger has taken the child. The first thought is this is something about the family. And I think the first suspects are often family members. So were the foster parents or William's actual parents ever suspects in the case?
You're quite right. And this has also been the subject of much testimony given at the inquest as well. In 95% of cases, when a child is murdered, the killer is somebody known to the child. In 95% of cases. So of course, attention will normally fall on the people who were closest to William at the time that he went missing. But there was one other factor here, and this too has been devastating for the search. He didn't live there. He didn't live at 48 Benaroon Drive. It's a big bushy block and he was visiting. And he ran around the corner of the house and wasn't seen for a moment. And so the immediate thought of police and searchers is he's lost. He's gotten lost. He's run off and he's followed a butterfly or maybe a wallaby or a bird, and he's gone into the bush and he's lost. And so their immediate thought was, we have to find him, because he was wearing such a flimsy little suit and it's getting cool on the day and he doesn't know the area and maybe he can't find his way back. And so the initial problem, as it was that they spent so much time looking for a lost child. And, you know, it's the easiest thing in the world to be critical of them for that. But I often think to myself, well, imagine if 2 weeks after William went missing, tragically he was found in a dam or a drain, because the drains in that street are quite big too. They've got big open mouths. Or, you know, people would be saying, why didn't you look? Why didn't you search? Why didn't you go down every single drain? Why didn't you look down every wombat hole? Why didn't you go up to the cemetery and find out whether he'd maybe fallen in somewhere? You know, we could have saved him. Maybe he was alive. So that search had to be undertaken. You can't be, not in good conscience, you can't be critical of people who searched for him. But the problem with the search is that because you're looking for a little boy who's lost, you're not doing any of the things you would do if you thought that it was a crime scene. So the police didn't put up any crime scene tape and they didn't cordon off the area. And people were allowed to come and go without being questioned. And cars were allowed to leave the scene and arrive from the scene without being searched. And so you can imagine some of the people who attended the search described it to me as having a carnival style atmosphere. You know, people came with their coffee carts to make coffee for the searchers, and you know, the CWA came with Lamingtons, and there were mums with prams pushing their kids along, searching and calling out William's name. There were people on horses, the police dogs came, and in the process you're losing all your forensics and you're losing all your DNA and you're losing any chance of any trace of William being found. And also, you're not searching the cars or the large wheelie bins or people's bags or any of the things that may have proven useful in the search for William, because you're looking for a little boy lost. And then you add to that that statistic I gave you before, where 95% of the time you're going to find the culprit in the immediate circle. So then you have to start looking at the foster parents and the biological parents. And although they're quickly ruled out as suspects, it's still time that's taken up. And again, there are people who are hugely critical of police. You know, I've seen that. Some people have come up to me and said, you know, they mucked this up. They mucked it up from the start. William didn't have a chance. Well, that's one way of looking at it. But another way of looking at it is to say, you do need to go through these steps and you do need to reassure yourself, what are we looking for? Could this really be the abduction of a 3-year-old in a quiet street in the middle of nowhere at 10 o'clock in the morning on a Friday? Because that's the rarest crime, not just in Australia, in the world. It is the rarest crime in the world, an abduction of a child by a stranger. It just doesn't happen, except it does. Once a decade, once a generation, it happens. But can you truly be critical of police for not suspecting it immediately?
And once the attention turned away from that immediate circle and then turned, as you said, to the idea of stranger abduction, the police's attention turned to a man called Bill Spedding. Can you tell me about Bill Spedding?
Yeah, so this is what police do. They start with a very small, very tight circle, and they try to eliminate all of the people in that tight circle. So they start by saying, could it be the foster mother? Could it be the foster father? Could it be the foster nana? Could it be the sister? You know, all the people who are in the house at the time. Once you've ruled all of them out, then they start thinking, well, okay, could it be his biological parents? Where were they on the day? They were very quickly ruled out. We know that they were not in Kendall on the day. There is a lot of CCTV footage of them in Sydney. William's biological father went to McDonald's very early in the morning to use the free Wi-Fi and to have hotcakes. His biological mother was very pregnant at the time. She was carrying William's sibling at the time, and she went into a shopping mall and bought a pram for the baby and some blankets for some baby. She's caught on the CCTV at the train station. We know that she bought Optus credit from an Optus store. She's caught also taking money from an ATM on the camera. We know they weren't there. And also there are people who say to me, well, maybe they arranged for his kidnapping and then they were going to get him later, but they've never been reunited with him, and they grieve him to this day. You know, William's foster father has turned up at every single day of the inquest in an effort to find out what happened to him. So this doesn't seem like the kind of people who secretly have him secreted away somewhere. So once you've ruled out all those people, then they start to think, okay, logically we know that William was taken by somebody who was in that street on that day. He wasn't taken by an alien. He didn't get picked up by a spaceship. He was taken by somebody who was in Benaroon Drive at 10:15 in the morning on the day of his disappearance. We know that for sure. So who was there? That becomes the question. And so they start knocking on the doors of neighbours, of course, and they start looking for whatever CCTV they can find. Tragically little of it, tragically little. 2014 was just before the widespread use of things like, you know, cyclists with head cameras or dashboard cams, which are popular now. And there isn't even very much CCTV from people's houses. You know how people now sometimes have houses with CCTV. There isn't even any of that. There's a little tiny bit of CCTV from the Kendall Tennis Club. One of the cameras was broken, the other one was working. There's a bit of CCTV from there. So you start looking at, can we identify any cars? Who was in the street? There was one thing that intrigued the police. A call was made from the house, from 48 Benaroon Drive, to a local white goods repairman whose name is William Spedding. He's been completely cleared. He's not a suspect in this case anymore. We can say that now, which gives us an opportunity to discuss openly why he was a suspect. I mean, why would he become a suspect? Because of that, because they were looking for somebody who may have been in the street on the day. And so we know that William's foster mum picked up the phone in the morning and she called him. And the reason she called him was because her mum's washing machine was broken, and it had been broken for a couple of days, and her washing was piling up. And this was something she noticed. She said to her mum, what's going on? And her mum said, I haven't got a washing machine, it's broken. And she said, well, what are you going to get it fixed? She said, oh, I had a guy out here, he needs to get a part. And the foster mum said, well, he can't leave you with a broken washing machine. I'll call him. You know, very common conversation in Australian households across the generations. She picks up the phone. She calls Bill Spedding, who is the local washing machine repairman. She gets the answering machine and she says, hi, I'm at 48 Benaroon Drive. You came to look at my mum's washing machine. When are you going to come back? So police are interested. Did he come back? Did he come back to the street? And if so, he's a washing machine repairman. Maybe he drives a van. Then it turns out that actually he has a complaint has been made about him in the past. It's never been verified. It's just a complaint that was made about him 25 years earlier. But police are intrigued by this detail and they decide to make him the focus of their investigation, and he remains the focus of their investigation for almost 2 years.
As you've said, he was exonerated, but in the process, I think it's pretty fair to say, I think he would say his life has been ruined. Do you think that collateral damage like Mr. Spedding is warranted in a case like this?
Well, you know, and again, it's one of those cases very difficult to talk about because Bill Spedding is now suing the New South Wales Police. He is saying that his name was dragged into this investigation and that his life was destroyed. His business as the local white goods repairman was completely destroyed. His family was destroyed. He lost friends in the process. He was made a pariah in his own community, and he's suing. And so because there is a criminal or a civil action underway, it makes it difficult to talk about the case. I think most people want the police to be able to chase down leads as ferociously as they can, acting within the law. I think they believe that you have to chase suspects hard. And if you've got reason to think that he might be a suspect, then you have to interrogate that possibility. The problem that they have is, why was he a suspect? Because he has always said that he was never in the street. The call was made to his phone, but he was attending a school assembly at the time. His grandson was getting a special principal's award, and he wanted to make a special effort to be there to see his boy get it. He said that he had a cup of coffee with his wife just before that in the Buzz Cafe in Laurelton, which is about 20 minutes away from Kendal, and he has a receipt for that purchase on his credit card. And he also has, there's also evidence, so evidence was given by somebody who didn't like him very much, who said, oh, his car was seen the next day, you know, thundering out of the bush near where William went missing. But turns out it wasn't his car, couldn't be his car, because he was attending an AFL presentation for a grandson at that time. So what his solicitor is saying is there was never any reason for him to be a suspect. I mean, police went to his house, they turned over the woodpile, they searched the premises, they took DNA from everything in the house, they seized all his computers, they went to his shop. He also had a pawn shop, which is a PAWN shop, you know, where you trade goods, not a pawn shop. And they took a mattress from the top level there, and they tested that, and they tested his van, and they looked at all of the available evidence, and they found nothing, absolutely nothing to connect him to the crime. So I guess the criticism is, why did it take so long to clear him? That's what his lawyer would like to know. Why did it take so long to clear him? And was his life unnecessarily destroyed in the process?
And that's coming before the courts, you've said, so we'll leave it at that. It's about 20 to 7. I'm going to be leaving time for some Q&A from our listeners and viewers today. So just a heads up for everybody in the audience, if you'd like to start popping your questions through now, there'll be time for your questions to be answered in the coming minutes. So questions, please use the question and answer facility on your screen to the right-hand side, and I'll be asking Caroline your questions 10 minutes, 15 minutes before the end of this session. A question I wanted to ask you as well, Caroline, is Detective Gary Jubilan. He's become very well known, and he became involved in the William Tyrrell investigation partway through. Is that correct? Why was he put onto the case?
That's right. So the originally the investigation was put in the hands of a very senior detective called Hans Rupp, but Hans Rupp was very close to retirement at the time. He'd been in the police force more than 30 years, and he was close to retirement. And, you know, everybody thought this case would be very quickly solved, because it just seemed like they would be able to solve it quickly. It just doesn't happen that children go missing and don't get found. You know, 90% of them are found within 24 hours. So eventually Hans Rupp had to take his retirement and hand the case over, and it was handed over to Gary Jubilan, who is also an extremely experienced New South Wales homicide detective. He took over the case in February 2015, which was about 5 months after William went missing.
Things have been very difficult for Gary Jubilan, and he ended up resigning from the police force fairly recently. Can you just tell me why he resigned?
Yes, because he was charged with misconduct in relation to the case. What Gary did towards the end, or what he's now been convicted of doing, although he is planning to appeal, is he was using his mobile phone to record conversations with somebody who lived in the street, that William lived in. It came out in the trial that he thought this man could be a suspect. Again, there hasn't been any evidence to link him to the case, but Detective Jubilan thought that he might be a suspect. And although they had him under surveillance, sometimes the listening devices didn't work. Sometimes the batteries ran out. Sometimes it was really difficult to hear what was being recorded. Sometimes the conversations would take place outside the house. So as I was explaining before about everybody having a big block, you know, big house on a big block, sometimes Gary would pull into the man's house and the conversation would take place outside. And so Gary was using his own mobile phone as a recording device, and that's banned. And there's a good reason why it's banned, because, you know, the public has a right to privacy. We all have a right to privacy. You have a right to know that your conversations are not being secretly recorded, and certainly not secretly recorded by the police. There is a Surveillance Devices Act in New South Wales. And what happens is if somebody is a suspect and you want to record them, or you want to put them under surveillance, so put bugs in their house or bugs on their car, you have to go before a judge and get a warrant. And they did have a warrant for bugs in this man's house and in this man's car, but not for Gary's mobile phone. And so he was convicted on those 4 charges. He was fined a total of $10,000. He was removed from the case and subsequently resigned from the New South Wales Police Force. He enjoys the support of William's foster parents, and he enjoys the support of many families in New South Wales that he has assisted when they have been mourning the loss of someone who is the victim of a homicide. There are many people who have said to me, you know, were my child to go missing, I would want Gary on the case. You know, he bled for it, he lived for it, and lost his career over it. And they feel like what he was doing because he felt like he had a proper lead. There isn't anything to link this man to the case. So there are others who say that Gary is guilty of tunnel vision, you know, that he concentrated too hard on him and maybe the real perpetrator got away. You know, these are very complex matters, and everybody will have a different point of view.
And that case is also before the courts. I think you've said he's appealing, so we'll again leave it at that. Which brings us to questions. We have many questions that have come through, Caroline. We won't be able to get through all of them, but I'm just going to ask you a couple. Well, I suppose that the first question is, do you think that William will be found alive, Caroline?
I hope so. I hope so. But if you're asking me honestly, I mean, he could be alive. And in some ways, we have to keep believing that he might be alive. I certainly believe that the answer will be found, that we will find an answer. I do believe that. I do. You know, the very old saying, only there are 3 things that cannot be hidden: the sun, the moon, and the truth. And the truth about William, I believe, wants to be known, and he waits for us to find him. And maybe the answer will not be the one that we want. Maybe it'll be something closer to what we're seeing unraveling in Europe at the moment with the Madeleine McCann case, where it seems, although it's very early days, it seems like there has been a breakthrough of sorts. And maybe it will be at the end of this process, the coroner will decide that William has died. But I still think we need an answer. I still think that the torture for families of not knowing means that we have to resolve and commit ourselves every day to finding out the answer. It would be very easy for this to become a cold case because we don't have a lot of leads, but we know a lot, and it's important to remember that we know a lot. We know a lot about where he was, and we know a lot about when he went missing, and we know a lot about who didn't do it, and that's important. And so we could well be within days or maybe weeks or months, or maybe it will be years, but I believe we will find an answer.
Question from Lauren is, do the biological parents still have a gag order on them? If not, are they choosing not to come forward, and for what reasons?
They do. All the parties in this case are restrained by law from communicating their identity to anyone. I think it's fair to say that in some cases there are some parties, or there are some members of William's various families that really want to come forward and really want to talk and really want you to know their story and want you to see them and see how much they loved him and how desperately they want to find him. And there are others who want their privacy, who think that the most important thing is to let the police do the work of detectives, and for William's family to be able to live without everybody, you know, knowing who they are in the street. Although, of course, most people who know William's family know what happened. But if, you know, there wasn't, as you say, a gag order on it, then, you know, William has a sister who lives in Sydney, and she is entitled to her privacy. And if her parents were known, or if her her foster parents were known, then it's possible that her identity would also be known, in which case she wouldn't be able to live with privacy. So there are those competing demands, and there are differences within the families about whether or not they want these gag orders as they're described. But at the moment, the coroner has said there will be no identification of anyone in any part of William's family.
Carter has this question: how do you see Gary Jublin's role and actions through his involvement? So what's your view on him?
I know Gary really well, and I feel like there isn't any doubt in my mind that he wanted nothing more than to find out what happened to William and to find him alive. I think in the beginning, certainly in February of 2015, he still thought that it was possible that he was alive and that he would be found alive. And I think I've never seen a detective who went to the kind of lengths that he went to. Now, for example, let me give you an example. On one occasion, somebody that he regarded as a suspect in the case called him, and it was a couple of days after Christmas, and he was visiting his mum, who had recently become widowed, and he dropped everything and got in his own car and drove to Kendall, which, as we know, is in the middle of nowhere, and to talk to him in case this was the breakthrough. And there's a number of examples of him doing that kind of thing. There's no doubt in my mind that he burns for the victims of crime. You only have to talk to him to know that he finds it untenable, the idea that he can't find an answer. I mean, he did say once, I can't stop. I have to keep going because I can't bear the idea that there is no answer. There are people who will also say, well, you didn't solve the crime. And in recording these conversations, you've created a problem because all of the energy now was about this case. You know, the case that was brought against Gary Jubilant, you know, that the energy that had to go into that case, he was on trial for 2 weeks in New South Wales. There were dozens of lawyers engaged. The brief was huge. That's a lot of energy to be dragged from the disappearance of William Tyrrell.
The next question is, why have the police given the foster family such an easy time?
I don't know that that's true. I don't know if I accept the premise of the question. We know, for example, that they were interviewed and very quickly cleared of any involvement in the crime. So, I mean, the key surely is to find out what happened, and they don't believe that they're involved, and they don't believe that William's biological family were involved either. And so they're out there looking for who it might be. Towards the end of the inquiry, the coroner's inquiry, the last set of hearings, we were zeroing in on sex offenders who live in the area, people who have long history of assault of small children. They're following those leads now. And if that's what the commentator means by, well, they're giving the foster parents an easy ride by concentrating on other people, I mean, police are trying to find out what happened. They want to know what happened. And they don't believe that the foster parents are involved.
I think that leads on to the next question from Stephen. Do you feel that William Tyrrell was kidnapped? Who do you feel did it?
I mean, for sure he was taken. He's not lost. For sure he was taken. That I know for sure. He's not lost up there in the bush trail somewhere. It's not going to be a case like we saw with Azaria Chamberlain where, the Spider-Man suit is going to turn up. And maybe he was lost all along. I don't believe that. I do think that this is the worst crime that we can imagine. I also covered the trial of Brett Cowan, who kidnapped and murdered Daniel Morecambe, Denise and Bruce's boy in Queensland. And it was interesting because there was an inquest into that case too. And of course, people will remember that people in the beginning, they thought, oh, Daniel's run away, because he was 13, he must be a runaway. People didn't take that seriously. as a suggestion that he might be kidnapped either. And again, it's very easy to jump to conclusions and just assume, oh, well, he's 13, he must have run away, maybe he had a fight with his parents, wasn't getting what he wanted for Christmas, and it wasn't true. He was taken by a notorious pedophile, a man with a long history of abusing children, and he was murdered. He was murdered, and people found that very difficult to believe, but it was true. And at the inquest, I didn't cover the inquest, I covered the trial. But at the inquest, about 10 well-known pedophiles who were in the area at the time were paraded before the judge. And every time, all the journalists thought, oh, well, this is the guy. Because every time they put someone up, it was like, these are the worst people in the world. They are just terrible people, awful people, with long histories of abusing children, taking advantage of children in their immediate area, and also of strangers' children. And every time one of them was called to give evidence, people thought, that's him, that's the guy. And then the next one would come along and he'd be even worse. And it was like that with Brett Cowan. As soon as he arrived, people thought, oh, it's got to be him. But then another one came in and people thought, oh, no, not him, him. And I think that's where we're at in this inquest. I mean, we are looking at really terrible people who happened to be in the area at the time. And we haven't fully prosecuted every one of those leads yet. And the reason we haven't is because of all of those things that we've discussed, because we spent so long looking for a lost child and so long looking at parents and biological parents and foster parents, and then looking at people who are in the street, and then looking at other people who might be possible suspects. And only now are we looking at the people who we generally know, in the case of a stranger abduction, take children, and that is well-known pedophiles.
The next question, I think we might make that the final question, is one that's really well canvassed in your book, Caroline, and one that I would have liked to have got to, but we've been talking and we've run out of time. So I just wanted to show again the book, your book, Missing William Tyrrell, and it really is a fascinating read. I also listened to it by audio, and Caroline reads it herself, and it's terrific. You really feel like you're there. And this next question I'm going to ask you, and you won't be able to answer it in detail, but it's a question about new leads, which is very well examined in the book. So I'd encourage everyone to read the book, to buy the book, to listen to the audio book. But the question is, and the question's from Julie, what was the outcome of the resident who claimed to have seen 2 speeding cars drive past his home with a small child standing up on the seat in one of them?
Yeah, so this is fascinating, isn't it? This came out in the inquiry as well, that there is a man who lives about 1.5 kilometres from where William went missing, who says that he saw William, not a child in a Spider-Man suit. He says he saw William in the back of a car speeding past his house at about the right time on the morning of his disappearance. And he wasn't immediately... that sighting, I think we can say, was not taken all that seriously by police. And, you know, there's complex reasons for that. There's complex reasons why he didn't come forward properly, and then why his story wasn't interrogated properly. And that's right, Suzanne. One of the things about writing the book is, well, firstly, I believe we can find him. Firstly, I believe that the case can be solved. There would be absolutely no point writing this book if you just thought, oh, it's an interesting crime story. I mean, this is a real little boy. This is a real child who really is missing, and from this state where we live. And it is absolutely incredibly important that we find out what happened to him, that we don't just say, oh, well, we don't know and we no longer care. We care, and we have to continue to care. And one of the ways that we will find an answer is by going through and looking at all the evidence again. And that's what I've tried to do in the book, to assemble all of these witness testimonies and people who were there and people who weren't there, so that everyone can look at it again and say, okay, we know where we went wrong. How can we now get it right? Because he's a real child. This is not true crime fascination. This is not some ancient history. It's right now. And we can still solve it. We can still solve. All these people are still alive, and all of these witnesses are still there. And it's still possible, I believe, to find out what happened. If I didn't believe that, I wouldn't have written the book. I would never have written a book that just was a book about a missing child. How fascinating. Never. I think that the answer is out there, and that the public hold the key and they will find it and police will follow it and someone will come forward and the answer will be found.
Thank you so much, Caroline. My apologies to other audience members who had questions that we weren't able to get to. But Caroline, fascinating discussion. Thank you so very much.
And I know you know a lot about the criminal law, and I know you know a lot about books and about crime, and that's why I really wanted to talk to you, Suzanne, because I know that you understand these issues so deeply. And you know, there are a lot of people who just want to have a discussion about what they see as a fascinating case, but I know that you feel it, and I appreciate that very, very much.
Thank you, Caroline. I'm going to hand over to Catherine to bid us good night. Thank you.
Thank you both, Suzanne and Caroline. I mean, you both feel it very, very deeply. That was absolutely clear, and it was a fascinating conversation, but also a very moving one. And at the heart of it, there's a little boy who we don't know where he is. So thank you, both of you, hugely. I was also very struck by what you said, Caroline, about him being a foster child. I've never thought of foster children being different from other children in the way they're treated, but in a sense this happened. So much to think about. So if you, the audience, don't yet have your copy of Missing William Tyrrell, you can order it online from our partners, bookshop partners, Better Read Than Dead, and they'll send it to you. And if you want a book plate for your copy to remind you of when you heard about it, email us, email Bad Sydney, and we'll send you one. You can also order Suzanne's latest book, The Deceptions, which is about another crime, but that's another story and another interview. And I'll end by whetting your appetite about our July event, which is completely different. We're talking to Meg Gardner, who's a best-selling crime thriller writer and an Edgar Award winner, about why and how she is driven to create psychopathic killers in her work, and how she does it and what impact that has on her. So her latest book is called The Dark Corners of the Night, which sounds pretty frightening. She'll be interviewed by L.A. Larkin, who also creates her own psychopathic killers. And we're going to do this on a Saturday morning, so not in the evening, but to get the times right for America, we have to do it at 10 o'clock in the morning. And then just to keep you going till September, we'll have another event with Aussie star, rising Aussie crime star, Megan Golding, fantastic book, which I've had a chance to read. So I hope you've all enjoyed the evening as much as I have, although enjoyed seems the wrong word really, but been fascinated and gripped as much as I have. Thank you again, Suzanne, and thank you so much, Caroline. Thank you for writing the book. We look forward to seeing all our audience again in July and then in September. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Karen.